So I've got a lot going on in this video. So I brewed a hoppy Pilsner, a West Coast Pilsner. That was a style targeted by the Brew Club, our average brew series for the quarter. Mine featured Citra and Mosaic. I'm also using a brand new yeast, NovaLager from Lallemand. It's my first time using it. It's pretty new to the market. Also, my fermentation chamber was tied up and I really wanted to get brewing this, so I thought it'd be a great chance to brew a beer in a keg under pressure. So I gave that a try. And then also, since I was fermenting in the 5-gallon keg, I thought that was a chance to kind of up my stovetop brew in the bag from my 2.5-gallon batch, try to get maybe 3.5 gallons into the keg. Well, if any of that sounds interesting and you want to see how the beer is, well, stick around. Well, I really appreciate you stopping by Cascades Homebrew. My name is Brent, so I got a lot going on here, so let's just get into some of the topics. The first thing I want to talk about is the yeast, NovaLager from Lallemand. So for support for the Brew Club, Lallemand has occasionally sent us packs of yeast. In this case, they had packs of their brand new yeast, NovaLager, and they're able to provide several to club members. So I got a pack directly from Lallemand. So Lallemand's put out some interesting information on the website and also on their YouTube channel, but highlights of this yeast are, it's a bottom fermenting Saccharomyces pasteur, a lager yeast, hybrid. They claim it produces clean lager beers with distinct flavor characteristics, fast fermentations, high attenuation, very clean, slight esters over a wide temperature range, classical and non-GMO breeding methods, also low VDK diacetyl production, and also no capability to produce hydrogen sulfide, which is kind of a sulfur, a rotten egg sulfur character. Although we'll see in my batch, I did get a little bit of sulfur, which is, I guess, is a little different type of a sulfur. So my thoughts with NovaLager probably fit in pretty well with the current trend of more warm fermenting lagers and also kind of fit into maybe hoppy lagers. And that was what the rep from Lallemand had told us. So he kind of pushed us toward doing a hoppy lager, which came with the West Coast Pilsner. So what about that style, West Coast Pilsner? Like I said, the rep from Lallemand said that NovaLager would probably work well in a kind of hoppy modern Pilsner recipe. So if West Coast Pilsner is really a style, it's not really well defined. I see quite a few different variants and recipes that people label as a West Coast Pilsner. In my mind, a West Coast Pilsner just has a couple attributes. So one would be a grain bill, very similar to a Pilsner, but featured mostly Pilsner malt, maybe with a little bit of character malt in it. Two, fermented with a lager yeast, and whether that's fermented cold or warm, well, I guess that's maybe debatable as far as at least how I executed it. And then that West Coast thing. So to me, that means it's featuring classic American hops, well, modern American hops. I think you could probably throw in New Zealand hops as well, but isn't that a New Zealand Pilsner? So I've looked at different recipes. There seems a lot of variation in how much hops they use, whether they're kind of using it as more of a Pilsner hopping level or an IPA hopping level. So I brewed a couple of batches over the last 6 months that really kind of fit probably into the West Coast Pilsner. They were kind of inspired by the cold IPA, so sort of like a cold pale ale, like a 5% one. So I have some collaborations with some local breweries. Actually, one to brew a 15-gallon batch of a West Coast Pilsner, and then also to brew a 12-barrel batch of a West Coast Pilsner. Hopefully we'll have some content for those in some future videos coming up soon. So in addition, this batch was fermented in a keg under pressure. So this is the first content on my channel about any keg fermenting or pressure fermenting. I tried it one time before with a batch of Voss. I don't think it was really that exciting or worth putting on the channel. So the theory is fermenting under pressure suppresses some of the yeast esters, so you get some of the benefits of a lager fermentation, being that kind of clean fermentation, with also some of the benefits of more like an ale fermentation. So you get that faster fermentation due to the higher temperature, and also you have less pitching rate requirement, so you kind of ale pitch rates versus lager pitch rates. Plus, I really wanted to get this one going. I was in the middle of brewing some beers for NHC, getting those finished up, so my fermentation chamber was tied up. So fermenting in a keg under pressure at room temperature, well, it fit my schedule. So also, since I was fermenting a keg, I figured I'd try serving directly from that keg, using a floating dip tube. Was that enough changes to throw in for this time? Well, how about trying to increase my batch size? Well, I brew on the stovetop in a 5-gallon kettle. So I usually target about 2.6, 2.7 gallons in the fermenter. That's about the max that my Fermonster can hold. Give me a little bit of headspace. I've done a couple batches where I got 3 gallons of wort out of the kettle, so I could do 3 1-gallon fermenters. Well, in this case, I was brewing in a 5-gallon keg, so I had lots of headspace. So I decided to push it up to get 3.5 gallons of wort. So to do that, I had to work in a sparge step, and then my kettle was pretty full before the boil. But hey, that part worked out pretty well too. Alright, well that's enough talking. Let's get into the recipe and the brew day, and then get back here so I can taste some of that beer. This one was part of the Brew Club Average Brew Series. So this is my average brew West Coast Pilsner. It's sort of like a hoppy Pilsner. As I mentioned, I was targeting 3.5 gallons into the fermenter, or just over 13 liters. Bitterness was calculated 39 IBUs, and the color was nice light at 4 SRM. So I calculated the recipe, targeting a 75% efficiency. That would have given me original gravity 1046. Final gravity was estimated at 1010 with an ABV of 4.7. As we'll see, I got a little lower final gravity with a little bit higher ABV. So the grain bill I decided on was about 88% Pilsner malt. So that was 5 pounds or 2.3 kilograms. And then there was about 8% of white wheat malt. So that was 0.45 pounds, about 204 grams. And then 4.4% of honey malt from Breeze. That was a 1/4 pound or 113 grams. So as part of the average brew guidelines, wheat and honey malt were in there as optional ingredients. I decided to use them thinking, well, maybe the honey malt will give a little bit more character. And then the wheat, I usually like wheat a lot, give a little bit of mouthfeel, a little bit of creaminess to them. In retrospect, I think I kind of wish I'd just gone with a little bit more, maybe 100% Pilsner, or maybe Pilsner with maybe just a little bit of character malt in there. So I start by measuring out my 4.9 so at this point, I noticed I didn't have a 5-gallon mark on my measuring dipstick. I usually don't need to measure that much. Well, with that fixed, I started by measuring out. So I need 4.9 gallons or 18.5 liters of tap water. To that, I had half of a Camden tablet to make sure I remove any chloramine and chlorine in my tap water. To support the larger batch size, so I set aside 1 gallon of water that I'm going to use for the sparge step. So to treat the remaining 3.9 gallons, or just about 15 liters of water for the mash, I add 3.5 milliliters of lactic acid and then 2.5 grams of gypsum, calcium sulfate. So with the strike water up to temperature, I stir in my milled grains. Now it looks like I'm just a little shy of my 149 degrees Fahrenheit target, but 148 degrees Fahrenheit is fine. I decide with the lower temp to let the mash go for 90 minutes, just to ensure full conversion and make sure I get good fermentability. So with the mash complete, it's time to remove and drain the grain bag. I move the kettle with the majority of the wort over to my stove to start heating up towards the boil. I then mix in the sparge water and give it a good stir. Sometimes I heat up the sparge water, but decided to just try room temperature water today. That seemed to work just fine. So after a 10-minute rest and another good stir, I remove and squeeze the grain bag again. With the additional wort added to the kettle, I'm looking pretty good with 4.5 gallons or about 17 liters of pre-boil volume. A gravity reading with my refractometer shows I'm at 1040, which is 4 points above my predicted 1036 value. So just before boiling temps, I added my first hops addition, which is a tiny amount, 0.18 ounces or 5 grams of Centennial. With the limited Heb space I have, I make sure to watch the kettle as it comes to a boil. I don't want a Bessie boil over on my stove. With 10 minutes left in the boil, I add some more Centennial, in this case 0.35 ounces or 10 grams of Centennial, along with some Irish moss and yeast nutrient. Now at flame out, I'm going to add more hops, in this case Mosaic and Citra, so 0.35 ounces or 10 grams of each. So I use a water bath to chill my wort down to the target hop steep temperatures. And then, while I'm at 170 degrees Fahrenheit or 77 degrees Celsius, I go ahead and add in my hop steeps at more Citra and Mosaic, 1.05 ounces or 30 grams of each. I let those steep at that 170 degrees or 77 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes. So I've generally found when I'm targeting, say, like a pale ale level of hoppiness, that a hop steep gives plenty of hop aroma and flavor. In this case, since I was fermenting in a keg, I figured that would be a better step than trying to open up the keg and add the dry hops under pressure. So just to clarify, no dry hops, but I did get a hop steep. So during the steep, I go ahead and get my keg ready. I won't go into too much detail here, but a while back, I picked a pair of floating dip tubes off eBay. There's a newer model available. I think it has some improvements that look pretty nice. So I think I've only used this one time before. So the floated dip tubes, they seem like they're well designed, well made. I like the idea of buying it from kind of this craft manufacturer right here in America. So the hop steep done, I use my immersion chiller to get down to pitching temperatures. And then I switch over to recirculating ice water to get down about 64 or 18 degrees Celsius. Since I don't have a great way to judge volume in the keg, I weigh out my empty keg and then I transfer the wort into the keg. A gravity reading shows I'm at 1052, which is higher than my target of 1046. So weighing the keg shows I'm a little low on volume. I suspect I didn't fully account for the loss to the hops, but luckily I've got a little extra gravity point. So I run some math that shows that adding 0.3 gallons will get me a target of 3.5 gallons and then get me right on target with my 1046 gravity. So here we are looking at the floating dip tube, well, floating. So now it's time to pitch my yeast. I'm using 1 pack of Lallemand NovaLager yeast. So I direct pitch the yeast right into the wort. So I then move the keg to a bathroom at my lower level that stays relatively cool and steady. I'm using this temp controller just to try to monitor the fermentation temperature of the beer. I don't have any temp controller to change the temperature on this one. So I hit the keg with about 10 psi of pressure just to make sure the lid is sealed and attach my spunding valve. The next morning, fermentation seems to be underway and there's a little pressure built up in the keg. I back off the valve to bring the pressure to about 15 psi. On day 3, there's a steady hiss of CO2 being released through the spunding valve. While the room temperature is around 67 degrees Fahrenheit, the reading on the probe is around 72 degrees Fahrenheit. On day 4 or 5, fermentation seems to be slowing way down. A few gravity samples indicate that I was at a steady final gravity, so at day 10, it was time to package the beer. Well, in this case, package the beer means I just moved the keg into my fridge and hooked up the CO2 line and the beer line. That was the easiest kegging day ever. So this is definitely one of the big benefits of both fermenting a keg and then serving from that keg. So I don't have to worry about sanitizing a keg, cleaning my fermenter after I transfer in the keg. I don't have worries about oxidation exposure. It's just so simple and easy. So to recap a little bit on the fermentation, so I chilled it down to 64 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 18 degrees Celsius. I was in the keg at about 15 psi at room temperature, which is sort of somewhere around that 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius. The peak wort temperature that we saw was about 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 22 degrees Celsius. And then it was day 10 when I decided fermentation was done. I was ready to move it into my fridge. So looking at the stats on this, so both with my adjustments, I came out with the exact same 75% efficiency with my original gravity of 1046. So attenuation was a little higher than the initial prediction, but maybe that's okay since it's a new yeast. So final gravity was 1006 with my ABV of 5.3%. Alright, so now it's time to drink some beer. I've got this really cool average brew glass that we'll see I pour it into. But before I open the beer, there's a couple topics I want to touch on just real quickly. So the first 3 topics I want to talk about are all related. So I fermented this one in a keg. 2, I fermented it under pressure. And 3, I served it directly from the fermenting keg. So the benefits keg fermenting, right? Stainless steel fermenters are pretty expensive. You can get a used keg for, say, $50 US. Sometimes they're a little bit more expensive, less expensive. You can get a brand new keg for maybe $100 US. So for a stainless steel fermenter, a 5-gallon keg is a pretty good deal. I think, some of the drawbacks, right, is you can't really get a full 5-gallon batch in there. But in my case, since I was brewing, smaller batch, it worked out fine. So when I got the end as far as the cleaning, it was pretty easy to clean up. It really wasn't any more work than just a normal serving keg. Maybe just a little bit more krausen along the top to make sure. It was definitely easier than cleaning both a fermenter, serving keg, and then all the equipment used to transfer from the fermenter into the keg. What about pressure fermenting? The idea that pressure fermenting is going to suppress esters, well, it's really hard for me to tell anything about that. This is a new yeast that I've never used before. It was a beer that had a lot of other characters, a lot of fruity characters from the hops. So it's really going to be hard. So I'd have to cycle back to tell you, am I a fan of pressure fermenting? I'm not quite sure. But serving from the keg, that worked really well. The floating dip tube in there, I think I needed to get my floating dip tube hanging down a little bit. So I was getting a little foam at the end. I think it was just because I didn't have the tube a little bit far enough so the float wasn't quite laying down. But I can change that just by how I position it on that little tube. So that'd be easy. I like to float it. It's a pretty good. I really like the ideas and some of the new one. One of the drawbacks I think of the current model I have, that there's just a tiny area on the filter for the beer to pass through, where it looks like the other one has a much wider area of filter that's like exposed to the beer. I noticed quite a bit of slowdown in the amount of beer that's transferred out the line, which isn't the worst thing when I'm using my picnic taps, because a nice slow pour makes kind of a nice pour into the glass versus it makes it a little easier to pour. But I think the newer ones, they look like since they have that longer filter, I think they look a little nicer. What are my thoughts about that larger 3.5-gallon batch on my stove? So I thought that was great. It really was very little more work than my normal, say, 2.5-gallon batches, but I got a full 1 more gallon of wort out of it. Since I was fermenting in a keg, I had plenty of headspace, so that worked well. So I think as I move forward, I'll be look for opportunities to brew a little bigger batch on my stove so I get more beer if it fits the needs. Alright, so I'm getting thirsty, so I need to open a beer. So the keg's been kicked for a while. I've been a little bit delayed in getting my videos put together. So let's open up a bottle and see how it looks. So one thing I would note is the beer took a while to drop clear. It did eventually drop clear, so I expect this to be fairly crystal clear. All right, there we are. That's a really pretty beer. So you can probably see right through it, see my the label. Crystal clear, just a nice light, kind of a medium golden, I would say. It definitely doesn't look like a Miller Lite, Bud Light. I've noticed on this particular pour, I'm not getting a lot of head retention. It could just be the glass. It could be this particular bottle. So this was a bottle that was filled from the keg a while ago. So what about the aroma? So I get hit with sort of, fruity aroma. Definitely that Mosaic, that kind of just dank, fruity, ripe fruit kind of character. Maybe a little citrus, since I know what's in there. But I think it's definitely more of that just kind of fruity character. So what about yeast? That's where I'm not quite sure. Is any of the aroma I get from the yeast, or is the yeast completely out of there? That's why I'm not quite sure this was the best recipe to evaluate a new yeast. There's so much this, fruity aroma in this one, so it's hard to tell. Am I getting fruity aromas from the hops, or fruity aromas from the yeast, or from both? Let's see, how does this one taste? So my thoughts on this one are, one, I think it's just a really nice, enjoyable beer. It's got a lot of kind of hoppy character. It's got that some flavors in the grain. The other thing I would say that it's not really what I was kind of shooting for like the Pilsner. I don't get a nice, crisp, clean Pilsner character like I got from those previous batches that were 100% Pilsner malt. That's what I think I mentioned earlier. So this one's got a little bit of honey malt in it. It's got a little bit of wheat in it. I think both of those maybe distract from trying to get that crisp, clean Pilsner lager kind of character in a beer. So I think it's more of like kind of blonde ale. I actually entered in a competition and I was looking for a category. I put it in there as a blonde ale. I think I knew that it was way too hoppy for American blonde. That's what some of the feedback was kind of like, oh, it's a good beer, just too hoppy for the style, I think was a lot of the feedback on it. So as far as the hop combo on this one, so I previously brewed a couple kind of similar batches that were 100% Pilsner malt. And the hops on those, the first one was Simcoe and Citra. The second one was Simcoe and Centennial. I think both of those hop combinations were just a little bit more crisp and clean, and they kind of leaned a little bit more into that crisp kind of Pilsner kind of character. Or this one, I think the Mosaic fruitiness, I think it just kind of distracts a little bit from the idea of a crisp, clean Pilsner-ish beer. It reminds me a lot of that what I called Summer Blonde that I brewed last year. That one was fermented with Kveik yeast at a cool temperature, but it had some of that same character and actually was a very similar grain bill. And that was probably some of my motivation because I really liked how that grain bill turned out. Thought maybe I'd apply it with the NovaLager yeast and this hops and just see how it turned out as sort of a West Coast Pilsner. But I think the grain bill and the hop combination on this one really just kind of pushes it into like just a hoppy American blonde ale feel, which is good. It just wasn't exactly what I was targeting. I don't know if you can see, there we go, the glass. Those are really cool glasses that came from the Brew Club. I really like the size. So they fit, I think, about 9-10 ounces or something. So do I have any closing thoughts on the NovaLager? Well, I don't think this was necessarily the greatest recipe to evaluate that. One, I'm doing the keg fermenting under pressure, which I haven't done before. I'm not quite sure what that is. I think there's just a lot of kind of fruity hop characters in here. Then I think the grain bill with the honey malt and the wheat, I think that distracts a little bit. So I'm really curious to use NovaLager in one of those other batches. It'd be really cool to see a comparison with, say, 3470 versus NovaLager, maybe fermented around that sort of 62 degrees Fahrenheit range, maybe even cooler, maybe warmer. So I think that's where the competition would be. Well, I'm not sure if I'll be able to get to that NovaLager versus 3470 shootout real soon, but I really like to do those kind of split batches, investigative type batches. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you get notified of my future content. And hopefully you've learned something from this video. Cheers!